Lammy, we're going to talk about emulators. That's what we agreed at the last conversation. I don't know where this is going to take us, but can you just to start us off, what is an emulator? I know I'm asking you for a definition of something that that neither of us are an expert in, but what when we talk about emulators, what are we talking about?
Let me just open up a Google tab and Google it. No, wow. I've never had to think about how I would define one. And from a technical aspect, I don't even feel like I'm qualified to answer. But what I mean when I talk about emulators is anytime that you try to play a game from one platform on something else that isn't the original
Yeah.
intended platform that it was on. Uh, you know, from the obvious example that comes to mind for me, which is playing, let's say, old Nintendo games on your desktop computer through a program that allows you to actually play that game, to, crazy things like getting Skyrim to play on a smart refrigerator.
Sorry, what? Getting Skyrim to play on a smart refrigerator? Is this a thing?
I don't know if
Or
they've actually done it, but it's been a meme for a long time that Skyrim keeps getting re-released on every single platform possible, to the point that, soon we're going to be seeing it sold for full price on your new smart refrigerator, playing it on your
oh,
touch screen.
I see. I see. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, well, yeah, I think that's 10 out of 10 for describing it as someone. I'm judging your description as someone who also has no idea what I'm talking about. But yeah, for me, an emulator is usually, as it is for you, to be able to play old Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Turbo Graphics games on my computer. But there are different kinds of emulators. So Steam has a Steam Deck, and essentially it can play other games. Usually what you need is a ROM file, which is the actual disk image of an old game, say Super Mario Bros. Put it into, like, have a file of that, and the emulator on your computer can read it, or on your fridge would be able to read that as well. The benefit, of course, of old games is they're very, very small. It was amazing how much, and we talked about this a little bit, how much economy of scale and how much efficiency they had in fitting an enormous story and platform for fun into a tiny little package of space on a computer. I've had a lot of fun with emulators and with what they play, but I wonder, I'm in my 30s. I play a lot of these games out of a sense of nostalgia to kind of revisit where I was when I was 8 years old or 11 years old, to enjoy either what I enjoyed then or what I missed at that time. I played recently Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, something we mentioned in the last episode, on an emulator because I never really finished it as a kid because I never owned it. I had to play on other people's Super Nintendos. And so it was almost not just revisiting what I had done, but getting a chance to finish what I never got to complete. But I wonder if this is all about nostalgia or if there really is a sense of playing old games to enjoy something that was good that we aren't doing anymore. Almost like enjoying an old movie like Citizen Kane, which, yeah, there's nostalgia for some people, but for a lot of people, you watch that movie and it is alive today. There is still a very powerful message to that film that no other film is communicating in quite the same way. So I wonder, what do you think about this question of nostalgia versus quality in playing old games on an emulator?
I think this question begs to be asked more when you consider a re release of an old game. So I would say I don't think it's just nostalgia. If we're just talking about emulated games and um, whether or not they have worth for playing more than just nostalgia, oh, 100% they do. If that game, if you have no other way to play it except in its original format, then no, I don't think people play it just for nostalgia. That's almost like asking why read one book over another. It doesn't really matter that it's older or newer. It's different content. It's something that people want to experience. If they've already experienced it in the past and they're just replaying it, I don't know if it's just sort of dismissive to say that, oh, they're just playing it for nostalgia's sake, or even if they are, if that's a bad thing. I think it becomes an interesting question, though, when you say if you have a re released version that does take advantage of all the new advancements in technology in the years since the game originally came out, and you still have the original, And we know there are so many people who would still prefer to play an emulated original over potentially a re-released version. And I think that's where the question comes, okay, so are they just playing it for nostalgia factor at that point? Are they just, not wanting to give in to newness and stay in the past? Or, the obvious thing would be potentially the re-release is missing something the original had to begin with. They changed it in a way that actually removed some of the magic that was there to start.
Or just changed it. It's, like in the last conversation, you talked about how a mod of a game is a different product than the original game. We're talking about different products here. And so there is an issue here of, it's not necessarily that the new release is losing the magic, it's just creating a different magic. And that may not be the same as the original. So an example of this is YS 1 and 2. So I think I've mentioned this before. These are games that I played on TurboGrafx CD years ago when I was probably around 10 years old. And they were not accessible to me every day. I could only play them on Saturday mornings for like 2 hours for a few months or something like that. Like, it was rare that I got to play. So I think part of the reason definitely for me to play these games is nostalgia, to complete something I never really got a chance to dig into. It's very different to play a game like this on a computer without the control. It's doing it on a keyboard and mouse is, or frankly, just a keyboard is a little bit more challenging, but you can get used to it and it's fine. But I'm certainly looking for the nostalgia. Now, those games have been re-released only a few years ago in a completely new form, but telling the same story, essentially bringing it up to date. Very different experience in that version of the game. Does it eliminate the magic? No, it's a different game though. And if I'm going back to this nostalgia, like you say, I've got to go back to those original games and play them on an emulator. But there is an issue when we talk about, if we just put nostalgia to the side, am I really enjoying myself when I play some of these games? So, for example, I played recently, you can play this online on an emulator. You don't need to download anything, Civilization 2, right? This is from 1993, I believe. Or maybe 1996, some point in the 1990s, Civilization 2. I was addicted to this game for a long time, way past its expiry date. And I played it recently, and it's really cumbersome. It's hard to play, which speaks to the fact that video games have evolved immensely over a short time. Talk about film. What are the big changes in film since Citizen Kane? One of the big changes is going from black and white to color. Okay, big deal. One of the biggest things is creating a vocabulary with audiences. So we kind of know what a director is saying with a wink. So they don't need to spend a 2-minute monologue communicating something. They can take one frame of one film to communicate that this person is betraying this other person, for example. But that's not a technical advancement. That's an advancement of a lexicon that we share with the filmmaker. Same things have happened with video games, but video games are completely different. If in preparation for this conversation, I watched a few YouTube videos about nostalgia in games. And what is nostalgia to many of these YouTubers is 10 years ago, which for me, coming from my long hiatus from video games, looking into it, is still the future. Assassin's Creed is the future of video games on a console, on a PlayStation or whatever they're played on. And so that's still something I'm yet to do. It's still in the future for me. If I play an old game, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which I really wanted to play on an emulator because I've heard that this was a revolutionary game. It's hard, it's cumbersome, it's old, to the point that someone, I think, reviewed it and said more recently that Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was a great game for its time. It was the game that walked so that later games could run. Do I want to play a game that is merely walking when other games are running? Like, truly, if I take the nostalgia out of the question and also take out of the question my desire as an aspiring developer to learn about these things and just have fun, wouldn't I be better playing Skyrim 5? Wouldn't I be better playing, right? Wouldn't I be better playing a game that is new? And I mean this openly. Like, I understand that there's another side of this question, but I genuinely want to know, if games are about having fun, shouldn't I be seeking the most fun if I take the nostalgia and the game development curiosity out of the picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge I would give to you there is you keep saying you're only playing the games for nostalgia's sake, and yet you said multiple times you never got to finish the games and you wanted to finish them. To me, that's not you're playing them for nostalgia. You are playing them because you want to finish the game. You were curious how the game finished.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe, you know, maybe your enjoyment for the game, part of it is because of nostalgia, and obviously you enjoyed something about it when you started it, and now you still have that curiosity. But you said it twice where you said, oh, I never got to finish it. You said it with the Legend of Zelda, and you said it with, what was the name of the game?
Uh,
Why?
East.
Yes,
Yeah.
is. Yeah, and I think that speaks more than anything else to why you were playing it, and why, if it wasn't available in its format that you were curious about, you were curious about the experience of it as it had been, because you said the other version of Yeast was just too different. It wasn't really the same experience anymore. To me, that's, I mean, unless you really weren't enjoying it. And as we know, you've said this before, that you have this desire for completion, even when it's not necessarily fun for you, because that is supposed to be what you find fun. So maybe then the nostalgia is a factor, but it sounds like you really just had a curiosity. You wanted to play something that you knew had a very intense effect on the gaming industry at the time, and you were curious what that was. And so I don't think that that's necessarily nostalgia. Just playing like an old timey game that you've played a million times on an emulator, which is, I think, the way most people use emulators. They'll play a game they played, you know, dozens of times before, because they want that feeling back. They had the feeling, they want that feeling back, right? That's the nostalgia. Um, there I could see the argument. But if you're playing it for the first time, I still think that there is a place for people to experience a game like Ocarina of Time for the first time. Now, it doesn't have to be on an emulator anymore. There are ways to play it legitimately through Nintendo and pay it for it, you know, potentially for the fourth or fifth time for people who've bought it on every single platform that it's been released on. Um, I still think it's worthwhile and more than just nostalgia if the person's enjoying themselves. And the question more is, for me, like I said, is what's the difference then? Do we trust the developer when they re-release a game? And if what they're doing, they're not changing, right, the way the game, they're really just polishing, which happens. They'll take the game, they'll polish the graphics is the biggest one, some of the performance and systems in the back end. And once in a while, they'll add some quality of life things in terms of UI and experience that would exist now that they've never discovered then. There are re-release games where they change the game, right? They change part of the story, or they really
Yeah.
fundamentally change something. And I think then obviously the original still has a purpose. But that's the question that's more interesting to me, is this romanticized idea that even if there's a re-release that's all shiny and with current graphics, that somehow the emulated old version might still be more enjoyable because it has the charm of the original.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a Twitter conversation about this recently, actually. First of all, when it comes to emulators, using an emulator itself is not breaking anything in terms of copyright. You can take a ROM from a game that you own, that you bought, put it on your computer and use an emulator, and that's perfectly legal. The issue is when you're downloading a ROM from someone else and then it's just being spread widely and shared. That's the problem. But the emulator itself is perfectly acceptable, at least from my understanding of this. I'm sure that many, especially modern console makers, would disagree, like PlayStation 5 or whatever. Anyways, back to this conversation on Twitter. A game designer essentially asked, are good graphics really that important beyond bringing people in to start the game? You know, in a trailer or a demo, we're showing people, look at how flashy and beautiful and wonderful this game is. And a lot of trailers and demos don't show actual gameplay. They show almost the cinematics, the glossy cover of the game, because we want people to come and play this wonderful experience. But once they're in, the graphics really matter to that same degree. And the contention of a lot of people is no, not really. They need to be good enough to not distract you. They need to be good enough so that you're not bothered by something you can't see or it being fuzzy on the screen. But the gameplay, the mechanics, the charm, the story, the magic that you're talking about is really what's critical, which is why so many retro style games, Undertale is a good example of this, are so successful because they're not dispensing entirely with the graphics. They're just saying that's not going to be our focus. We're going to focus on the gameplay and the magic between us, and we're not going to let you be distracted by looking for these incredible graphics, because if you want that, go see a movie, or go play a game that offers that. So I think with that in mind, or that conversation in mind, my answer to your question for me would be absolutely. Sometimes the original contains a lot of the charm and a lot of the magic that a re-release might not contain, or might not be able to capture the lightning in the bottle in the same way. There are other examples, though. A series we bring up many times, or I bring up, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, have enhanced editions. So re-releases, yes, a lot of content added to them, but the experience is pretty much the same. There's a lot of quality. It's essentially a modded version of the original game. So yes, a different product, and a lot of people still prefer to play Baldur's Gate as it was originally intended, with the 5 CDs or however many it was, 5 DVD. And I guess there were CDs, not DVDs. But for me, I would prefer the enhanced edition, because they haven't really affected that magic of the gameplay. It's still there. They've added to it. They've kind of fixed the edges and stuff like that. But I'm fascinated by this question, because it then begs the next question, which is, what is a magic that can be imparted into a game? What is the lightning in the bottle? What are we trying to achieve with the design of a game? So for you, what's an example of a game that you go back to time and time again that was made a long time ago?
I think if we're talking nostalgia, and the games that I go back to purely for nostalgia's sake, and usually I don't, play for I just go for it for that nostalgia, that hit of, man, I used to have fun with this. I can't not bring up Warcraft. And for me, that was Warcraft 2, I think. I think even Warcraft 3, I actually don't really have those nostalgic memories of as much, again, showing our age. But I find Warcraft 3 quite modern. And and the fact that there was online play, and it led into World of Warcraft and MMORPGs and all that, feels very modern. And I don't know if a week goes by in our household where, somebody says, I'm ready, and I don't immediately go, oh, I'm not ready. And from the, there were what were they called? But they were the guys with two heads, that one of them would say, I'm ready. And the other guy would say, I'm not ready.
We're ready, master. I'm not ready.
Warcraft is one where every once in a while I feel like, and I've done this too, where I've downloaded some version of it somewhere just to play, and I only end up playing like a couple of campaigns or something, and then it scratched the itch that I had. But and that's all nostalgia. I have lots of fundamental memories, right? Those memories that build up and stick in your mind. So I go back to that one. Then there's some really strange ones that weren't very good games even at the time. But again, if we're speaking just for nostalgia, for whatever reason, I got interested in them. And I'll go back periodically to check on and be like, is this as bad as I kind of remember? Or that is to say that I have a feeling that it's not as good as I remember. Let's check. And I'm usually correct. There's like silly online games. There would be these Flash games or Java, actually like actual Java applet games from back in the day, that you'd go to websites and they'd have them. And I think even those were emulated, sort of.
Okay, would javagameplay.com be an example of this?
Yeah, I used to go to like addictinggames.com, and they had like a bunch of Java applet games. And so there was like a Roller Boy and Roller Girl games that I would go back to once in a while. And then I find myself remembering this particular game that I think I've forgotten the name of once again. I always have to do this. Like every few years, I'll have to go and research this game again, because I want to make sure I'm not making it up and it's not a fake memory. But there was a 3D game on the old Macs, the humongous ones with like the colorful see-through transparent backings. And what were those ones called? I feel like I'm not remembering any technology.
No,
I was a child, and Apple ruled right in schools. All schools here, at least in Canada, or at least in BC at the time, had Apple computers. And as a good student, I would be allowed to go play, some games on it when I finished my other work. And there was like at the time, just mind-blowingly amazing 3D, I think it was called Bugdom. That's what it was. Bugdom. And you were a little bug and you could move around, and it was kind of a sort of Metroidvania-y, puzzly, like you had to unlock, find the key to unlock the zone. But it was all like third-person 3D, which at the time was just, and I remember the graphics being so great. And
Totally.
the weird thing is, when you go back to it, I'm like, you know what? This isn't actually bad, considering this is a game from like 1997 or something. This, like, honestly, the graphics aren't that bad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have many memories of this. I remember, I think it was IMAX. Is that what they were? With the colorful, like the G3 or something like that, which had the colorful blue
Mhm.
or pink transparent backing or whatever. Yeah, totally. I remember I was in a science class. This would have been grade 5 or 6, something like that. And every morning for like 20 minutes before the class, we were allowed to go show up early, play on the computer this spaceship game or whatever, and I have no idea what it was called. But we would all just, that was the best part of our day, was the 20 minutes before class even started to just fly this spaceship in this really, for us at the time, graphically insane game. And this would have been, 1995, something like that. So probably on a Windows 95 computer, I imagine. If not, if it wasn't a Mac, and I don't recall exactly what it was, but I remember those computers at the time. Um, and here's an interesting question. The games that were made at that time, obviously they were made for a different audience. They were obviously made at a different circumstance, and they were made with different equipment and different capabilities. But were they made for a different kind of gaming? So, for example, a lot of people would say that Nintendo is something you'd come home, have 20 minutes, turn on, grab your controller, and just drop into. And so, as a result of that, these games could be really, really difficult as you got later into the game. Much more difficult than games are today, where people are playing for 7 hours at a time, where people are investing into the same game over a long period of time. Does the actual act of gaming and how that has changed over time, even with people of the same age but in a different generation, affect how a game is designed? I mean, I'm sure the answer is yes, but I guess my actual question is how is it different?
How? That is an interesting question. I almost feel like the fact that people are playing games for more hours of a day should mean that games should get harder. Because if anything, people are becoming masters much quicker at any game, and that you need to challenge them more and more. And, there is this idea that games are a lot easier now. I don't know that games are necessarily easier. I think I agree a bit more that they are maybe more hand-holdy, right? So
Okay.
but that was also maybe because of the kinds of games that were being created. So once technology got good enough that you could kind of have open world, or at least games where you're walking around in some sort of sandbox and moving your own character around, they started to realize, okay, how are we going to get people to know what to do? That was one of the big challenges that developers had. And especially if people are now spending hours and hours playing this. And those kinds of RPGs already, I think, transcend the type of gaming that you're talking about, even the old RPGs like Baldur's Gate, because you can't just say, oh, I have 20 minutes, I'm going to go pick up and play, because you need to remember what you were doing. You need to have a plan. You need to go through something. The kind of quick old Nintendo games remind me of arcade games. And the difficulty curve in those makes sense because, well, they were trying to get you to spend more money, but also turn over as many people as possible. And I don't think it's necessarily just based on time. It's also probably platform, right? Arcade, and then even the at-home consoles, Ataris and Nintendo, more feeling like an arcade platform, then realizing, oh, if this isn't going to be an arcade experience, if it's an at-home experience, we can start providing something different. I think that did change. And I wonder now if we're going to go backwards a little bit. I'm seeing more and more adults talking about how they don't have time to play video games and how they really appreciate games where you can just pick it up for 20 minutes in between doing other things and feel accomplished and feel like you can dive into the game. And I think that when you asked what is the difference in the kinds of games that are going to come out of that, I think you get mechanically heavier games when it's a pick up and play, in terms of just you are just playing through bullet hell, or something where there's a mechanic, as opposed to a longer story or even strategy game that might take, like, it could be a strategy game, but it would have to be short to allow people to finish it in that kind of time. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
the horizon of your goal is maybe only a few minutes from now, as opposed to a 1 hour match where you're building up your forces and all that stuff. I imagine mobile games actually answer a lot of these questions, where people are doing it in the interstices of their day, where they're on the subway or having a 5 minute break between meetings or something, and they can go on their phone and play Wordle, or play just a one line of Wordle before they have to go into the next thing. The other aspect about the 1990s that was so different, and the 1980s, of course, was dominated by Japan. The development industry was not exclusively, but dominated by Japanese developers. And so a lot of the ethos and the graphics were reminiscent of not just that culture, but a lot of the idiosyncrasies of Japanese creativity. So the quirky, really quirky characters. Whereas once Western developers started to take the lead, you see a lot of pretty, and this is not my own idea. This is something that I read about earlier today. Just a simple, plain white guy who's saving the day. No quirks, nothing special, nothing. You can't pick him out of a crowd. Whereas a Japanese developer would be looking for what is really different about that person. Um, this is just one idea of maybe how games in the 1990s would have been different. You mentioned Warcraft II, which is something that I would say is definitely nostalgia for me too. That I can't imagine how many hours I played that as a kid. What is it about that game, not just that was so compelling for you, but that continues to be so compelling for you? What draws you in to Warcraft 2?
I really like games where there's kind of increasing, like a buildup of both skill as you're playing, but also you are getting increasingly stronger or bigger. And, kind of like a tycoon game, or, there's that, it scratches the fact that I like to play on efficiency and figure out, so if I'm playing a level, obviously there's like the enemy. I never really found Warcraft to be too hard to like beat any of the levels, but I would play the game of, how efficient can I be with all my resources? So, and how quickly can I grow, so that I don't burn out, everything that I have, and like the planning, right? That's really fun and it's satisfying. I think it's satisfying to just see resources roll in, and you get more dudes and you're winning, and you're exploring the map. And as a completionist, of course, I didn't want to like end the level before like exploring every little bit of the map. Like if the goal was just beat the level, that wasn't really as fun as just playing in the playground of like mining resources. And I could totally see how something like even Minecraft would have still come from this idea, or like of tycoon games and of building games and base building games. Because, man, and again, I think it's still curiosity. At the end of the day, it's curiosity. What's behind that fog of war? And now that I've built this building, what kind of dudes can I make with it? What new upgrades did I get? Because I found, like, I'm just so curious. I love seeing the tree, the skill tree branching out and growing. And honestly, I'm just curious. What is this thing? And so, speaking of that developer player communication, is really, you're going like, what did the developers have in mind for us? Like, what did they put into this game that now I get to discover?
And did they even intend for this to be the kind of the fun that we're having? You play games like Warcraft, and there are these campaigns. You can follow the story. Starcraft is the same thing, and there's an absolute RP element that they're creating for you. And I did a little bit of that, but I would much rather 9 times out of 10 start a random map and build my base and enjoy the building of it. Yeah, you mentioned it. I build this building, and so what can I get because of that building? What does that allow me to do? And kind of tying it all together. And if the enemy was too hard, at some point I would just cheat and say, "Okay, I don't want to lose. I'm building my base here, and I'll just destroy you in 20 minutes once I've enjoyed crafting what I have in my mind." And I think that there's an enjoyment there that today developers absolutely can predict and know that this is happening. Paradox Studios is a great example. They come up all the time in our conversations, because they know that people want to just build something, that they want to explore the tech tree, and they want to see, and they want to imagine something. And there's another element to this too. I'm not sure if it's true for you, what it is for me, which is, okay, I'm building my base, I'm building the wall up here, cutting down trees to get lumber so that I can bring that with stone and gold, to have enough resources to build this castle that I've been waiting to build, all of this stuff. But in the midst of all of that, I'm imagining if I'm really there. In the midst of all of that, I'm imagining what would it really be like in this moment to actually build this and be part of this. And then there's another story that the developers aren't telling that I'm telling, that I'm creating my own narrative. It's the emergent gameplay of me faced with this mechanic. I don't. I'm curious as to how many other people do the same thing, and to what extent that is important for them. For me, that can be the number one reason I play something. Is that at all true for you? That emergent RP?
I don't think it is. And I've had the same discussion with Artemis as well. I think he really enjoys like those aspects of games, and you guys share and overlap a lot of the games that you really like. I don't think I have that as much. Like I said, I think for me it's purely curiosity. I'm interested in if the color of the pixels behind this bit of fog of war are going to be different than the color of the pixels. I mean, obviously there's a story. The story is, what are those colors of pixels? Like, ooh, these ones are trees of a different kind, or which is a new resource, or, obviously they mean something. So maybe I do what you're saying. I just don't think of it the same way. Like, I don't realize that I'm telling that story. It's just happening very organically, and I'm not thinking of it as me making my own story. But I don't think of it in that way. I don't think of like, oh, I'm imagining or creating a story for myself. And I've mentioned this part before too, that I think it's more like I want to be there in the story that the developer had intended. So I think what I do imagine is, what is the story the developer wanted me to think about? Not so much with the actual, like, the RP aspect, because that's clear because they're telling me the story, but the curiosity of the environment or the tech tree or all that. Then I do start to create a little bit of a narrative in my head of like, oh, this is what they were intending for us to realize about the connect. Like, let's say there's two tech tree items that have linked resources. Like, oh, maybe there is a story there of how they both were able to use this particular kind of gem or something to be powered, and that's interesting. And somebody on the development team thought about that and how it would work together and not just be completely randomly thrown in pieces of tech. Like, I like that aspect of it. Like, oh, it's all internally consistent. And I think about that. But I think of it as, again, being the generally like teacher's pet version of me, is I want to play into the story and read into it what the developer had kind of intended, because that makes me feel like I'm successful at the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I did have one more question for you too, just to bring it back to emulators, just because I was curious. Speaking of emulators, you brought up that Spaceship Game you were playing in 1995 or thereabouts. With respect to what we've been talking about today, now that you've remembered it, do you think you would have interest in looking it up and seeing what it was like? Like, because that'll happen to me when you ask me about what do you keep coming back to. I'll just have, every once in a while, I'll uncover a memory I forgot I had, and the nostalgia is what makes me look that up and see if I can find a version, see if I could find a video or a playable thing to scratch the itch of the curiosity of that memory. Like, would you do that? Would you go back and play that game?
I have. Yeah, 100% yes. Not that game, because I have no memory of that game except this image of sitting in this classroom and like jagged shapes on a black background. I remember so little about it, but I do have the visceral feeling. So I wouldn't know where to start. I guess I could look up games released in 1993 to 1995 or something with a space. I guess I'd probably be able to find it. But that's happened to me with other games without question. There were a lot of games on the TurboGrafx 16 platform that I've looked up and tried to find and played again. Certainly that's why I use an emulator is to kind of revisit that nostalgia, not to play for very long, just to kind of, even for 30 seconds, just to be, oh yeah, sometimes it's just the music,
Mhm.
you know. East is a game where some of it is just listening to that music again to take me back to that
Mhm.
place. Playing it, yeah, I've played it a little bit, but it's hard too. Like the East game is not just hard in terms of mechanically, but it's a puzzle game, and like remembering what door that is. And there's this, when you get up, anyone who's played this would know East 1 and East 1 and 2 are kind of the same game divided into two. And at the end of East 1, you're in something called Darn Tower or Darm Tower. And the the idea is you're going up this tower, spiraling up. But on the screen, you're just going from right to left, left to right, endlessly. And there's like 100 doors, and you're like, "What? I don't know what door that is." And eventually, you just want to say, "I just want to look this up." And how many doors do I pass before I go in to get to the next step? Because this is really tedious. Of course, at the time that this game was released, there would have been a feeling of, "No, I got to get there because no one else has played this before. There's so other few people who have played this before," and there was a freshness to it that propelled me and others to play. Um, but yeah, there's other games as well, that I could list that I've looked up because I just want to see, are they close to how I remember them? And this is
Yes.
total nostalgia. I'm not going to play them because I think they're going to be good. And another game, which is the inverse of this, Chrono Trigger, I never played, and I don't even know if I'd ever even heard of until very recently. This was a game, I think, for Super Nintendo, 1990s, early 90s, RPG, sort of Legend of Zelda esque. Um, and I started to play it, and I found it, I should still play it, but I found it really hard to get into because I found it very at the beginning like, oh, I get this. Okay, I got to go save this person. I got to go get a sword. Got to get some money to buy the sword. Like it's just predictable and almost like watching an old movie that has the monologue telling you something that a modern director would tell you in 2 seconds. Do I really need to listen to this monologue? Right? And I do. I should play this, but that's my struggle. And I think part of the issue with nostalgia playing or playing for other people's nostalgia, which can be a problem.
Yeah. And so to get slightly philosophical on you here about nostalgia and emulators and playing games that you played as a child, do you think that part of it is about trying to know yourself better? You said you wanted to know if you remembered it accurately, and I have that same thing. I'm always, part of why I look them up and why I'm so curious is I have all these deep rooted memories, and I'm like, am I remembering this at all accurately to what real life was? But there's another aspect of, this thing was so important to me, I need to know it because knowing it might tell me something about myself. Like, do you feel that maybe in a
Yes.
philosophical sense, emulators allow you and nostalgia allows you to check in with who you once were and why something was so important to you?
Yes. Again, 100%, but also not just to find out who I once were, but how that led to who I am now. Like the self curiosity
Mhm.
is a driving force behind this seeking out of nostalgia. Like almost to the extent of, if I find this old game, I might find a part of myself that can now be explained. You know, if I find this old game, I might find why I want to play games today that are similar to it. I might find the thread line between Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past to East 1 and 2 to Baldur's Gate to Pathfinder to D&D to, you know, this circuitous pattern in my life might be more revealed. Is that important? To me, it is. I don't know if it is for other people. Clearly, it's to you. Um, but there's something interesting about that. And I might be a bigger, better, stronger, more interesting, at least to myself, person by going on that journey and finding these things out. In the same thing would be true for someone who's looking for old books they read as a kid, right? Like my wife is not a gamer, never really played any games, but she read a lot as a kid. And there would be a very powerful driver for her to go and find these books when she was 8 years old that she read and see how that would affect her now and see where they bring her back to. I think memory is a very powerful force. You know, sometimes the smell of pizza will take, or a particular kind of pizza will take you back to sitting in a cafe when you were 9 years old. And it's not just a philosophical or analytical question. It's a visceral, almost kinesthetic question of how did it feel? In the same way that a painter tries to transport you to a time and a place, memory can do the same thing. For pure enjoyment, you can take out the analysis for a moment, although that's a big part of it for me, but just to enjoy that feeling of being transported, I think is a big part of this. And so, yeah, I don't know how that fits into design or development or anything like that. Not that it has to, but it probably would if I'm seeking who I am and what I'm trying to do. Yeah, so I guess to put the question back onto you, what have you discovered about yourself through looking through the lens of your own nostalgia?
I think the discovery has been that I am really driven by curiosity and exploration and discovery, like all of those kinds of things, that it feels really good to discover something, to learn something. And I can see that even in the games I used to like in the past. And also, I can see that I was definitely motivated also by social interaction, and that the game could matter less if there was a social aspect in playing with friends. And therefore, like couch co-op and couch multiplayer was always a big love of mine as a child, and continues to be today, because it's more fun. It almost doesn't matter, right, what the game is. It's just an excuse for a certain kind of interaction with people that you care about. And it just facilitates that. And I found that by looking at old games, because, they either fell into the bucket of, okay, this is clearly a game that tickled the things that I found interesting, or this was a game that by all other metrics I should not find interesting, but clearly I enjoyed because I was playing it with friends. And that's kind of where all the old games I like fell in. But it also shows that all of these philosophical reasons why someone might want to go back is a good argument for why emulators have a really great place to exist in the industry. And so for me, it's not even, I wish more actual first party developers re-release their own games. They don't have to even remake them, but allow them to continue to be playable. Backwards compatibility in terms of being able to continue playing old games, I just think is super important. And
Yeah.
the company's not going to give that. I'll take an emulator any day to get that feeling again. I think it's important that something that is created, that we try to maintain the ability to consume it into the future, because you can very easily have a burning of the Library of Alexandria sort of experience, if Steam just popped out of existence, and we lost access to all those games that we thought we would have access to. They probably still kick around somewhere on the internet, but that idea of like what happens if the internet just goes away instantly and we lose everything that we assumed would be accessible forever. With games, it can be like that, and you can lose games. You can lose access to playing something if it didn't stay, if the technology that it was played on no longer exists, and emulators can be the only way to get that back.
Well, you're totally right. We're desperate to preserve works of visual art. We're also very keen on preserving books and film. I read somewhere that 80% of all films prior to 1930 are gone forever and irrecoverable. That's not just a loss of consumption. That's a loss of history. That's a loss of understanding who we are. We're talking about understanding who you and I are by going back into our past. Well, we as a species, as a civilization, need to do the same thing to succeed, to thrive, to make better decisions in the future, by understanding our past. And as an art form, games must fit into this to some degree. And there are societies that are preserving games. It is becoming more normal. There are groups out there, but they have their hands tied behind their back so long as developers aren't interested in not just maintaining the code or the files, but maintaining playability. There's a lot of games I have on Steam that are unplayable because they're not 32-bit or 64-bit or whatever it is. I completely agree. We're at the end of our time, so you know what's coming. And there's a lot of stuff in what we just talked about that we could pull out and dig into more, and I'd be excited about that. But if there's one thing that we haven't really discussed that you'd like to, what would that one thing be for the future?
Well, selfishly, since we just sort of started talking about it now, we could maybe at least start the session next time talking about, this potential loss of of a game and digital versus physical and technologies going and companies going out of business and ownership, because I think the interesting conversation there will be, what does it mean to own a game now compared to previously, right? When you get to that digital versus physical question. So we could probably dig into that for a little bit.
Perfect. You've decided. You're the decider. See you then.
See you then.